These are the keys to smooth application. So to understand application, you need to understand the anatomy of the nail brush. The tip is the lightly feathered end, the belly is the middle of the brush, and then the heel is the complete back of the brush. Having good application is not based only on your technique, but what you use as well. I like to use Viva paper towels because it helps keep your brush clean during application, as well as your liquid to powder ratio on point. A reminder when doing nails, use as many beads as you need. So picking up my first bead, I wait a second before placing it down so it can become moldable. The technique I use when doing nails is tapping. I do not drag the acrylic because I don't want to thin anything out. Before working the bead down, I like to play with it a little bit so it can become less runny. And then I begin to tap and move the product down towards the tip of the nail. Make sure to tap your sidewalls and keep the shape of the nail, as well as sealing the top of the acrylic so that it is not a huge lump in the middle of your nail. If you drag too fast, you will pull all the acrylic down to the bottom of the nail, therefore causing a weak nail. When your bead begins to get a little dry, it's okay to push your brush back into the monomer to wet it a little bit. Make sure the acrylic covers from sidewall to sidewall and your tip is a nice thickness. Okay, so now I'm going in with my second bead, making sure not to place it too fast because I do want it to stick to the nail. Once I place the bead on there, I begin to work it into the shape of the nail. I'm going around the top of the bead to seal the bead to the nail, as well as seal the acrylic to the sidewalls. I'm using very light tapping motions with the belly of my brush because the brush is not very runny, but it's also not very hard. I have to use the belly of my brush when I need to apply more force. The tip is for light and runny areas. As you do this, make sure to swipe your sidewalls very, very lightly so that you do not ruin the acrylic. So just continue to tap the bead down until it is ready to blend. I can tell it's ready to be blended because the acrylic is setting in place, and I have done all that I needed to do with keeping the shape of the nail. If the bead was wetter, I could use the tip of my brush to blend it, but because it's not, I use the belly of my brush. And now I'm just tapping and feathering the sides to make sure everything is in place. Because if you keep your shape during application, it will be less time filing. Throughout this process, if the bead becomes too dry, I tap it in the monomer. And if the bead gets too wet, I tap my brush on the paper towel to not add to it. Okay, so now I have placed 2 beads. And I need to make sure my apex is thick as well as my cuticle is covered. I can cover both in the same bead, but it's up to you. You can place 1 bead to get the thickness for your apex and 1 bead to cover your cuticle. When you get around the cuticle area, try to use smaller beads and place them just a hair below the nails and then push it up towards the cuticle instead of trying to place it directly below and end up flooding the cuticle, because that is what we do not want to do. Keep your nail tilted downwards and let gravity do a lot of the work to keep the nail from flooding. Okay, so now I'm using light tapping motions to seal the acrylic to the sides of the nail, making sure no acrylic is on the skin. Once again, I'm swiping the sides of the nail first and then working my way to the middle last to make sure I keep the shape of the nail, as well as most of the thickness is in the middle of the nail. This is where the tip of your brush comes in. I use it to clean the cuticles and make sure no acrylic is on the skin because we want a nice clean look. And if acrylic gets on the skin, it will begin to lift. And here I am using the heel of my brush to move some acrylic around because the acrylic is almost fully dry but still moldable. I just had to use a lot of pressure. So now I'm using my brush wet to make sure everything is as smooth as it can be. And I'm checking my nail from all angles, checking the apex, checking the sidewalls, the thickness, making sure everything is to my liking. And when I looked at the side, I noticed that I do want my apex a little thicker. You also have to remember you are going to go in and file a little bit. So I do add slightly more acrylic. But I went back in with a small bead to make sure I can get the acrylic to my cuticle as best as possible. And I'm tapping the top to make sure it's completely sealed to the nail plate, because that is what prevents lifting. And I'm making sure to tap and babysit the acrylic while it's at the top of the nail and not move it down, so I can build the thickness at the top. Don't be scared to use extra beads to build the nail to what you need it to be. Once again, I'm using my brush to make sure I tap all the acrylic and make sure it's sealed before I stop. And yeah, so now I have the nail as thick as I want, as smooth as I want, and shaping will go by very quickly.